Do you want to learn how to hand knit a beautiful, large, chunky wool blanket like this one here, or like the ones you see on Pinterest? Well, I'm going to show you. First, you got to pick the right yarn. I chose Yarn Bee Chunky Spiral yarn in the color Field of Blooms, but you can pick any really good bulky yarn. To start off, I'm going to set my yarn on a large working table. This is really helpful, though not necessary. I'm also going to start with a slip knot here, so I wrap 2 strands of yarn around my finger, pull the back over the front, and make my slip knot, but you can make a slip knot however you're comfortable making one. Now we have to do the foundation chain row, so I am putting my fingers through the loop and then pulling some yarn through that loop that I have around my fingers. I'll do this a couple times here so you can see how that works. But you just pull the yarn through that loop over and over again. Once you get to the end of however many chains you want to make, this is going to be the width of our blanket. I made mine 32 chains long, and you can count them by seeing these little bumps on the top here. So you just count how many bumps you have, and that's how many chains you have. Now, when you've got as many chains as you want to be the width of your blanket, in this case I have 32, I'm going to flip the yarn over so I can see these bumps in the middle of the chains instead of just the regular V shape. Now, in order to work our way back, we're going to grab each of those top loops and pull up a bit of yarn from our working yarn through that loop, and we're just going to leave these loops loose on the top here because that's what is going to create where we place our third row of yarn. So I'm just grabbing each loop, working my way back the other way and pulling through that working yarn, that yarn that is attached to this giant spool of yarn that I have, and working these loops up here. Now, these should be large enough so that they don't slip out from your blanket, but small enough that they're the appropriate size for the tension you want to have on your blanket. So these are a good size to have here. Here's another view of how that's worked. I am just going to be grabbing the top little bump there. That's going to be my stitch, and I am putting my hand through there and then pulling through the working yarn with my other hand. So I sort of push my thumb inside that loop on the chain row that I have, and then use my other hand to gather some yarn and pull that through. Now, the yarn I'm working with in particular is a chunky wool yarn, and it is pretty fragile to work with. You can't pull it too tight, and sometimes it's knotted like this, so I'm just going to take my scissors and I will cut away the excess here. I'm not going to mess with the knot or try to work that yarn any other way. It's just going to get worked into the blanket and it won't be a problem. So I'll make sure that knot's sort of on the back side and then pull up another loop, and then I'll forget about it because it really doesn't matter. Now, if you choose your own blanket yarn, I would recommend getting something different than this large wool. It is quite expensive and a little bit difficult to work with, but it turns into a really nice blanket. Okay, now we're ready to work our way back the other direction and work on our third row here. So I'm going to pull a loop through that last chain space I have, and then I'm going to pull another loop through that end there. So now I'm making my third row. And then each loop that I had left on that second row, I'm going to be pulling another loop of yarn through that there. So now I'm finishing off the second row while starting the third row, and we can see that it's making a really nice pattern there. And so we're just going to keep working it like this until we get to the other side, and then we're going to switch directions again and work it the other way. And the time has come for me to add my second skein of yarn. Since each skein of yarn that I got is about 120 yards, I'm just going to use 2 of these skeins for my entire project. And I'm just going to tie a knot in the yarn here like this, and then I will be cutting off the little fluffy bits at the end to have a knot similar to the one where we had in the beginning, and we'll make sure we leave that to the back of our project and make sure that the front of our project stays really nice and lovely. I'm also going to be taking that wool that I just cut off the yarn and adding that to my little yarn scraps jar. I use these yarn scraps in other projects for stuffing and things like that. So it's always good to have a jar handy around, or maybe you just have an extra bag where you put your scraps in. Instead of throwing them away, it can be useful to keep those around and use them for other projects. The time has come to finish off the top of our project. Now I'm leaving quite a long tail up here, but it turns out to be just the perfect amount. So you do need to leave quite a bit to finish off your project. Now you'll pull up 2 working loops here, just as if we were having any other row on the blanket, but you take the furthest to the left loop and put it over the one in your right. So pull up 2 loops, take the one in your left and put that over the one in your right, and that's going to finish off the top end of our project so it doesn't get unraveled or come undone or anything like that. Now let's take a closer look at that. So I've got a loop here from my previous row. I'm pulling up a new loop of working yarn, taking that other loop that we would otherwise leave untouched if we were continuing on, and putting that over top of the loop that I just created. So you make sure you get 2 loops to work with and put one of those over top of the other one and secure that there. Now, when it comes to finishing your blanket, you will do this method of putting one loop over the other and do that all the way until we get to the end. So we'll pull up a loop and put the left loop over top the right loop and pull that through. Once we get to the end, I've got 1 loop remaining, and since I can't put it over anything else, I'm going to take my working yarn and pull that through the loop, which secures that in a knot at the very end. Now we have to weave in the tail. I'm going to use a crochet hook here to assist me in weaving this tail, but it's totally not necessary. You can weave in the tail using your hands and making sure to sort of weave in a zigzag pattern. You don't just want to weave down in a straight line, because then after a time your loose yarn end will come loose. So you want to make sure that you're weaving it in a manner where it's not going to come easily undone. Now I'm not going to weave in this entire yarn tail end here, one because it's wool and it stretches out as I'm weaving it in, so that's why I'm twisting it all up again. But 2, it's a little too much to have to weave in this whole tail end. So I'll just weave in a portion of it and then secure that, and then I will move on to weaving in the starting tail as well to finish off the blanket here. So when I've decided that this is weaved in enough, I will go ahead and snip the end of my yarn there and add this lovely tail to my yarn scraps jar. That's going to be some nice fluffy stuffing for later. And I wasn't so sure about this particular style of yarn not coming unraveled, just because the end of the tail is quite fluffy and all of the strands are really coming apart, so I decided to just grab my handy dandy needle and some thread to then sew this together. Now I chose a white thread because it would match the white strands of yarn, and I'm just sort of stitching around and trying to really tie in those tail ends there. I actually don't do this for the other side of the blanket because the wool actually comes to a nice gradual ending rather than this piece that I sort of snipped off like that, and it's got those very I don't want to say sharp, but it was a lot of tail ends coming together at the same time. The other end sort of gradually came to an end, just as your hair gradually comes to an end, rather than having it all cut and be the same length at the same time. So I ended up stitching both ends in a different way, but either method works. And when I'm done threading that, I will just snip that and put my needle in a safe place so I don't step on it, which is always nice to have a place for your needle. And that is the end of making this blanket. So let me show you what the final product looks like. So these two skeins of yarn at 120 yards each gave me a blanket about this size after hand knitting it. It's a nice throw blanket size. If you were going to make one for your queen bed or king bed, you'd need to look up the measurements of that and make one quite a bit larger than this. Thanks so much for watching my video on making this fantastic and super fluffy, chunky, hand knit wool blanket. If you want to follow along some of my other crafting adventures, feel free to subscribe to my channel because we make cool stuff here. Bye!